Welcome back, everyone. We have an awesome guest today. Her name is Dr. Jessie Hoffman. She's a registered dietitian and she has a PhD in nutritional sciences. She's also an assistant professor at Winthrop University, and we're grateful to have her as a guest. So thanks, Dr. Hoffman, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk today.
Yeah, it's we're really looking forward to it. Brendan and I always get into some type of nutrition talk, so
I think I'm most excited to talk about poop.
Yeah, please let's let him get all of that out right now, because he can't just keep bringing it up.
Is that a poop pun?
Low key. Yes.
All right.
We love
Okay,
it.
here we go.
All right. Yeah, so if you could start by maybe just giving us some brief background on you, maybe how you got into the field of nutritional sciences and any relevant background. Feel free to go back as far as you feel relevant.
Sure. So like y'all mentioned, I have a PhD in nutritional sciences, and the way in which I got here was not, I didn't set out from a young age knowing that this is what I wanted to do. During my high school, like towards the end of my high school career, well, I guess going back, I had always been interested in like medicine and that type of field. And I had always thought I would either go into like nursing or become a doctor or become a veterinarian, those are like my three top, I guess, career goals growing up. So I always loved the sciences, but towards the end of my high school career, I kind of fell in love with nutrition for the wrong reasons and developed a pretty severe eating disorder, which ended with me in the hospital and then ended with me in a treatment facility for several months. And so I missed about half of my senior year due to being treated for anorexia nervosa. And that is a ongoing struggle, not ongoing now, but that was kind of like an underpinning of my life from my senior year of high school, probably through the entirety of my undergraduate career, was just something that I was constantly working towards recovering for and battling internal thoughts. And that's really why I got interested in nutrition. And thankfully, I had some great mentors and guidance from my parents and friends and family that saw that my interest in nutrition going into college was not probably the best for me to go down and pursue like a nutrition path at that time. So I went to a very small liberal arts school for undergrad. We had about like less than 1,500 students, which was great for me. Number one, because they offered me a full ride, which is, if we can get out of school debt free, like win-win.
Absolutely.
And number two, I just had a lot of one-on-one attention. I wasn't going to get lost in the crowd, which was great for me as a student and also great for me in terms of like recovery. My professors, I was very open with about it. They knew about it, and it kind of could hold me accountable for, in some sense. So I went through with biology, and I dabbled in just straight biology with plans to maybe go to vet school. And then I switched halfway through and decided that I was going to be a high school like science teacher. Did that for like track in college, was heading down that road for about 2 semesters and decided I didn't want to teach high schoolers. I kind of decided at that point that I felt strong enough in my recovery to really pursue like a passion in nutrition that I felt at the time was genuine. And looking back, I do still feel that it was a genuine belief that I was helped by so many people in the nutrition field to self out of my eating disorder, that I kind of wanted to go back into that field to be able to give back. And I know that learning about the science behind the way our bodies work and the fuel that they require was very healing for me. And so that's at that point why I decided to go down and pursue a master's in nutrition, which I went to UNC Greensboro, which I can't hype that program enough for my master's. It was the most incredible educational experience. I learned so much, had a great mentor, got to do research, basically the whole shebang. And then that led me into my PhD program in nutritional sciences, and kind of how I got into that field. And then along the way, I came about becoming a registered dietitian in a kind of backwards way for most people. traditionally, the way to become a registered dietitian is you go and get your bachelor's in dietetics or nutrition, and you get what's called a DPD verification statement, which means you've taken all of the courses required to become a registered dietitian, which that allows you to be eligible for a dietetic internship, which is about a 1-year-long internship, unpaid, and you pay typically. To then be able to, after you do that internship, to sit for the like board exam that we have. So instead of doing that during my master's and PhD, I took those DPD required courses along the side. So I took undergraduate courses along with my PhD courses in research, and was able to get pretty close to finishing that DPD verification statement when I realized there was another avenue for PhDs to in nutrition to become registered dietitians and kind of bypass the traditional internship process. The traditional internship process works kind of like the match for like residency. You send out a bunch of applications and you rank your top 5 or so, and then they rank you and you have to match up, and basically wherever you match, you got to go. Like otherwise you're not becoming a dietitian. And luckily for PhDs in nutrition, we have what's called an ISPP, which is like an individualized, supervised pathway to becoming a registered dietitian. And your internship is kind of set up by you. The program that I went to was like pretty much a rolling admission, direct admit, wasn't like a match. And so that's how I ended up becoming a registered dietitian. So very long-winded to say, got into nutrition for the wrong reasons. And it kind of just evolved as I went, never had a straight plan. And the more and more people I talk to that go into their like PhD programs, most of them didn't set out in undergrad or high school to be like, I want to go and get my PhD. It's kind of like you just kind of fall into it.
Yeah.
I was going to say it seems like an advantage to a certain sense though, because I feel like you have a full scope of a lot of aspects around nutrition and not just this one direct path, which is really nice.
Yeah, I definitely love that I have a pretty diverse educational background. I love the fact that I was a biology major in undergrad because I got courses in a lot of courses that were preparing me for like vet school. So like I took my freshman year a course called Comparative Vertebrate Anatomy, which was literally just like a dissection. Like you just came in and you just dissected about like every possible animal they could get their hands on. And you learned about like shark brains and like all this kind of crazy stuff. So I'm very thankful that I got that experience and to a sense have like a little bit of a diversified background. When I talk to people now, my pathway, master's in nutrition and PhD in nutrition, worked really well for me. But there are some advantages into maybe getting a master's in like exercise science and then a PhD in nutrition, or vice versa, to where you have kind of like different backgrounds that complement each other in a sense. Another thing in nutrition that would be helpful would be like a background in like counseling, like a master's in some sort of psychology would be really helpful too.
Is that
So
common that people who are going into PhD programs in nutrition have aligning, but maybe not nutrition specific degrees?
the most common that you see is usually like the exercise nutrition crossover.
Okay.
Sometimes, so with the taking like a step back, looking at like bachelor's and master's. So to become a registered dietitian right now, you just do the undergrad pathway, and your internship and you're a dietitian, you're good to go. Starting in 2024, you're going to have a master's degree too to be able to sit for the board exam. And that's where I feel like I would encourage people to diversify their backgrounds there, because a master's in nutrition is great. You get a very high level, but there are also other fields that really complement being a dietitian really well. So like I said, like counseling, maybe like an MBA, something, if you want to go in private practice, it would be great to have like your MBA. Exercise if you're interested in like sports and things like that. So that's where if I was going through it again and I was doing just like our undergraduate and masters for the RD, I would probably try to diversify a little bit there as well, and not do like an undergrad in just dietetics and a master's in just dietetics. At least do an undergrad in dietetics, which is like the clinical side of things, and a master's in like maybe like a more nutrition science, like the more biochem side of things,
Got
at
it.
least. Yeah.
Mhm. There's so much there. I think there's like so much information that I feel like you have to know in that role. Like
Yeah, for sure.
it's overwhelming to kind of think about.
As a dietitian, is that what you're
Yeah.
asking? Yeah. Yeah, and your internship, well, and it kind of, the dietetics training, your coursework shapes you in this area throughout your entire like course sequence. But there's three main areas that a dietitian can like go into. So the most common being like a clinical realm, work in a hospital, work one-on-one with clients. Even if it's not in the hospital, it's still in like a nutrition counseling, kind of what we call MNT, medical nutrition therapy, something that, you know, prescriptive diets for specific conditions, stuff like that. You can also do community work. So you could work with SNAP, you could work with WIC, different community organizations that work on like food security, food justice, those kind of things. And so there's tons of different organizations that RDs help out with in the community. And then the least common, and I feel like people kind of look over this, but RDs have a really strong role in food service. So there is typically a dietitian that is like the head of food service for a like hospital. So they direct all, it's not like, it's not like you're in charge of like making the meals, but you basically are managing, it's basically food service management. So you're managing the whole entire operation. There's that same role for like school districts. Typically, there's a dietitian that manages all of the food production and operations for school districts, and things like that. And then, of course, you can go into like governmental roles too. You could go work for, I know dietitians that work for the USDA, and some that work for the FDA, and some that help set our dietary guidelines that come out every 5 years. So there's a pretty wide range of what dietitian can do, and I think people reduce it to just like what they traditionally think of like a nutritionist to be, is just like, I'm going to tell you what to eat. Um, we do a lot.
Yeah. Do you, when you were going through your PhD, did you have to choose a specific like emphasis within the field of dietetics to focus on?
So my PhD was a little bit interesting. So I went to the University of Kentucky for my PhD, and they have a dietetics department that doesn't have a PhD program as of right now. They have a master's and an undergrad program. And then they have in the College of Medicine, so that one is in the College of Agriculture. And then in the College of Medicine, they have a nutritional sciences department, which is heavy research. You take all of like the same courses that a lot of the med students take in terms of like biochemistry courses and stuff like that. And it's just largely research focused and nutritional, like biochem and metabolism. A lot of our faculty there work on cardiovascular disease and its interaction with nutrition, and things like that. So that's the more research lab heavy side. And that's the one I was in. And so with my program and with a lot of PhDs, it's in the field of like sciences, you get admitted to a lab in which has like a primary research focus, and then you get to kind of build off of there and decide where you want to go into. So I got admitted to a lab that was part of a big research center. It was called the Superfund Research Center. And so they worked on the study of environmental pollutants, specifically pollutants called PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. And they looked at their interaction with overall like metabolic and cardiovascular health, and the role that nutrition could play in preventing and attenuating some of those outcomes. So I got into the lab. They studied largely just straight cardiovascular disease, um, and the interactions between nutrition there. But I came in with an interest in the gut microbiome, and I was like, well, the background information that we have on these pollutants shows that our primary source of consumption of like getting them into our body is through ingestion, which obviously has to bypass or like has to pass through the GI tract. And you're like, anything that goes through the GI tract has the possibility to interact with the microbiome, and that was not an area that was being researched. And so that's what I studied. So my first real research study with my PhDs just established that um, those pollutants did interact with the microbiome and alter its composition, and were associated with metabolic changes that we saw systemically. I did mouse work, not human works. You can't dose humans with pollutants and study them. It's not ethical.
Not yet.
Um, and then the second study I did looked at a intervention to target the microbiome and see if we could attenuate some of the effects. And so I used inulin, which is a fiber. It's a prebiotic fiber. Prebiotic just meaning that the bacteria love it and they metabolize it really well. We can't break it down, but our bacteria have the enzymes to digest it. Because of that, it can be highly gas producing. And so lots of people don't tolerate it well, but it is one of the strongest prebiotics that we have. And so that was what that study looked at. And we did see beneficial changes with like glucose metabolism, protection against cardiovascular disease risk factors, and pretty dramatic shifts in their microbiome that we would consider to be more like quote unquote healthy. So I don't know if I answered your question because I started
Yeah.
squirreling, but
And you were mentioning the PCBs. Is there like a classification of like PCBs? Is there like a layman's term? Like, would that fall under like it's an antibiotic and we're getting it from food, and
no,
that's something
it's
I want to get into later, obviously, is
so
antibiotics on the microbiome,
PC
but
PCBs are a like class in of itself of pollutants, and there's like 200 different forms of PCBs.
mhm.
Um, and they fall under a category of what we call POPs, or persistent organic pollutants. So organic meaning just their chemical composition, persistent meaning they largely resist degradation in the environment, which is why they are a problem. And so the PCBs that I studied are a known carcinogen. And so that was determined in the 70s. They were banned from their production. They have really like advantageous chemical properties. So they're very like thermally stable. They were used primarily in like transformers and like hydraulic fluids and lots of things like that. And so when those things would break, they would leach into the environment. And then what happens is they bioaccumulate along the food chain, where it gets into the soil, it gets into lowest levels animals. Those animals that are above them on the food chain eat them, and then it accumulates in the bodies of those animals. And our primary route of consumption are through like fatty products, because the pollutants themselves are lipophilic. So they are attracted to like fat. They are fat kind of based. And so we find them primarily in like fatty dairies and meat. And then salmon is a pretty large contributor as well, just due to the nature in which some of these have leached into the water system, and then the salmon accumulate them within their bodies as well. And I forget where I was going with that initially, but
No, that's okay. Yeah, and it's so interesting because I don't know if it's very similar to what you're describing now, but the like the pesticides that are used in a lot of foods, I was pretty shocked to find out that there's a lot of things like the glyphosate. I know is like the big one that people talk about when they talk about pesticides. I was pretty fascinated to find out that there's trace amounts. Like we've used it so widely for the last however many years that it's almost impossible to like, even organic foods are being grown and have trace amounts of glyphosate in them because it's in the soil, it's in the air. Like rainfall can put
Mhm.
glyphosate on plants now. And I
Yeah.
was just like, dang, like we are buying organic food, but like we're probably getting a lot of the same stuff that we even think we're avoiding.
Yeah, there's a large myth kind of like going off of that. There's a large myth that organic is like quote unquote healthier, and that it's like pesticide free. And because of that, those reasons, it's not technically pesticide free, and there are organic pesticides that can be used as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's quote unquote healthier. And then in terms of like, so I was the only nutrition PhD student in my lab. The rest of my lab was toxicology. So I kind of got to interact with them and
Oh,
learn from
interesting.
them, which was really cool because I would have never studied any sort of toxicology otherwise. It wasn't something that I was like super like keen on going into, but just kind of like happened that it was related to my topic. But you have to think about a lot of the studies that we do, and even the studies that I did in my PhD, largely with pollutants, we are relying on mouse and cell culture data, which doesn't always translate well to humans. And even the levels in which I was using in my animal research would be indicative of someone that would get an occupational exposure to PCBs, or certain populations throughout the US. We have Superfund sites, which are these contaminated sites in regions of the US that have high levels of certain pollutants like PCBs. And there is a population in Anniston, Alabama, where there is a factory there that used to manufacture and have a lot of these PCBs. It's leached into the environment. These individuals have high levels of PCBs within their body and blood, and they are being a very like heavily studied population for like what are the outcomes that we're seeing here, because again, we can't go and dose someone with PCBs and see like what happens. We just have to kind of
But it might be
find out.
happening by accident, so we can
Yeah.
kind of study those people.
Yeah. So there's what you have to think about there is even with glyphosate, a lot of the evidence is in animal models and in cell culture models, and they're using doses that are super high and relatively not attainable by humans who are not falling into a vat of glyphosate or living in an environment where it's been leached largely. But that being said, the area of pesticide research and like toxicology with environmental pollutants and stuff is still relatively young and incredibly difficult to study for the reasons that I've outlined. So it's definitely something that you still want to be like cautious about, but be like an informed consumer and know that just because a cell culture or mouse study says that it causes this metabolic or health outcome, that it's not something to necessarily get super alarmed at until you really evaluate like how much is physiologically possible for me to ingest and actually get into the cells in which they're saying have the effects.
Yeah.
Before we move any further forward, like the idea of the gut microbiome didn't even come into my vocabulary until like a couple years ago, I feel. So could you just explain like on a basic level, like what it is and
Yeah.
why it's so important?
So we have tons of different like microbiomes in our body. We have like a skin microbiome, an oral microbiome, and basically various regions on our body harbor these microorganisms, which are not just bacteria. A lot of times we reduce it to only bacteria, but they also include yeast, fungi, and even viruses that are just natural to our, we would call them just normal flora. And they may kind of live in like a symbiotic relationship with us. They may provide us with some benefits. We may provide them with benefits from hosting them within our body. But the gut is really the large focus of a lot of research on the microbiome because we have trillions of bacteria that reside within our gut. And to date, we have over 1,000 different species that have been identified of different bacteria that live within our gut. And so largely a lot of the research has focused on just identifying who is there. And like you mentioned, you've only come into like real like noticing like the term gut microbiome come up, and it's really in science to in the broad like realm of science, it's incredibly young. We've really only been studying this for 20 or so years, 10 years really focusing on the gut microbiome. And so there's so much that we need to learn. And largely a lot of the research up until this point has just focused on identifying who's there, which we now know that that's not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily tell us the whole picture, because who's there doesn't always tell us what they're doing. And what they're doing is thought to be more beneficial or more of how they are exerting their effects within our body, because our gut is pretty, in most people, outside of GI illnesses or certain diseases, our gut is a pretty tight environment, closed environment, pretty separate from the rest of our body. And that makes sense. We don't need bacteria floating around our bloodstream. Otherwise, that's sepsis and not compatible with life, very deadly. And so the way in which these bacteria largely communicate with the other regions of our body are through production of metabolites that then influence certain cell signaling pathways and other processes within the body. And so the large metabolites that have been focused on for most of the time that research has been done on the gut microbiome are something called short chain fatty acids. And these are basically what the name implies. They're very small fatty acids. There's three primary ones: acetate, propionate, and butyrate. and they have various functions throughout the body. So butyrate is thought to be the like quote unquote most beneficial of the three, in that it is used within the intestine and the colon cells pretty extensively, and helps them maintain like a healthy barrier, helps with their cell turnover. But then acetate, propionate, and butyrate systemically can have differential effects on cell signaling pathways. And so they can influence certain metabolic pathways throughout the body. And it's thought that they can be, to an extent, anti-inflammatory, but there is also kind of a interaction with them, like more of something is not always necessarily a good thing. So in individuals with at really high weights, some of them tend to exhibit very high levels of short chain fatty acids. And that's thought to potentially contribute to their like energy. They seem to be have a greater capacity at harvesting energy. So these short chain fatty acids get produced from the fermentation and metabolism of like largely dietary fiber. So like I said, fiber for us doesn't contribute much calories because we can't break it down physically using our enzymes, but our microbes can. And when they produce short chain fatty acids, that does give fiber a level of caloric value because it can, those fatty acids can be metabolized as fatty acids. So it's thought that certain individuals have a greater propensity to producing short chain fatty acids, and that may push them into a more of a positive energy balance where they are going to be gaining more weight because they may not be eating more, but they may just be harvesting more energy. And so that's like another area in kind of like the obesity systems map, in which we know that obesity is a multifactorial issue. It's not just caused by, it's not willpower based. It's genetically driven, it's socioeconomic status driven, and then it could be possibly driven by your microbiome as well. So yeah, the large way in which our bacteria communicate with us systemically is through production of different metabolites. And they also can produce certain neurotransmitters, aid in certain vitamin production, and some hormone production. So we're learning more and more each day about the role in which they play on our like overall health through those mechanisms.
Is it safe to say typically when it comes to gut microbiome that like diversity is important, or are we looking for like high volumes of specific types of bacteria in our gut?
So we tend to, based on most of the research that is out there, a greater diversity is typically correlated with better health outcomes, largely just for the functional capacity that would exist with having a greater diversity. Is just, you have the capacity for doing all of the different various metabolic functions that the microbes are providing us with if you just have a more different species there. So we do tend to believe that a greater diversity is more beneficial, and it's kind of what we would, what researchers label as like a healthy microbiome is if you have a large amount of diversity. But again, there are limitations to that because we can feed individuals certain high fiber diets and their diversity can actually go down, but we know those high fiber diets are beneficial for overall health. So it's not always black and white, but nothing in nutrition is ever black and white. So
Yeah, that's for sure. As a side note, before we go more into the gut microbiome, because I have many questions, if I, as a average citizen, just wanted to go and like get my microbiome tested, how would I do that? And is there a specific company maybe that like will provide like a detailed breakdown and like what the results are? Or is like, how would somebody evaluate after getting their microbiome tested?
yeah, so this is a question I get a lot. And it's something that I tell people. Getting your microbiome tested is more of a just a snapshot of your microbiome at that one moment, not indicative of your core microbiome or your long-term microbiome for various reasons that I can talk about. And so there are various companies that are able to test it. There's tons of this like precision nutrition and precision medicine kind of like at home do it yourself testing is becoming like
23 and me.
the rage. Yes.
Yeah.
And so you can order any type of test that you want. You can test like urinary hormones, you can test your microbiome, you can test your genetics, but with that comes a lot of caveats and a lot of warnings that we have to put out there, in that a lot of these methods are not necessarily the gold standard, or you can't interpret them by yourself without the help of a practitioner who's trained.
You mean
And
WebMD? I can't just go and like do my own doctoring on myself?
yeah, I'm sure. I can't imagine. So just being in the nutrition field, I know how frustrating it is for, people to come with, like self-diagnosing themselves with nutrition issues. I can't imagine what it's like being a doctor in today's age where everyone comes in. It's like, I think I know I have this. And they're like, okay.
Yeah.
But with the microbiome test, I largely discourage people from doing them, because they are fecal microbiome based. So our fecal microbiome is more indicative of the microbiome that we are eliminating. Yet there are correlations
Right.
between our microbiome that is within our feces and our microbiome that exists within our gut. But we know that if we give someone like probiotics, we see a lot of those bacteria come up in the feces. It doesn't mean that those bacteria colonize the gut. It just means that they're passing through the feces.
Yeah.
And so the way in which we analyze the microbiome is through various methods, but the most prominent is 16S ribosomal RNA sequencing. So basically, you are sequencing the genetic material of the microbes and identifying them down to sometimes the species level based on specific genetic markers. So all bacteria have what's called the 16S gene. And so we're able to sequence that because this gene has regions that are highly variable, meaning they're going to be very specific to the individual microbes, and then they have regions that are highly just redundant and throughout all microbes. So we can basically identify that they're bacteria and then use the variable sequences to identify which specific bacteria it is. So that's largely how it's being done. And there's various methods to do that. And the methodology is another sticking point with sequencing your microbiome, because you can use two different sequencing or different methodologies and get completely different results. So that's something within the field that we need to work, that we're working towards, is trying to find like a gold standard, like this is the way that everyone needs to do it in order for results to be consistent and comparable. But again, like your fecal microbiome is only indicative of what you're passing through. We have in our guts microbes that exist both within the lumen, which is like basically the tube, like in the center of the tube where it's interacting with various like dietary components and things that come into our body. And then we have like our mucosal microbiome. So those that live more closely to the wall. We have like a mucosal layer, which has a large amount of mucin, which is just like gel-like protein substance that a lot of the bacteria stick into. And so a lot of our core microbiome lives there. And then what passes through the center of our lumen is more transient and more influenced by diet and environmental factors and things like that. And so when you're sequencing the fecal microbiome, you're only sequencing that luminal microbiome and what's actually passing through, and not gathering the whole picture. Taking that a step further, the other issue with sequencing your microbiome is we currently don't know, there's not much actionable information we can give you in terms of what to do based on your microbiome. There are companies out there that have just seen the profitability of this like field and have jumped on and said, okay, well, we'll tell you exactly what to eat based on your microbiome or stuff like that. And it's like, we're not at all, scientists in this field will agree that we're not at the level in which we can be prescribing diets based on your specific microbial makeup. There are tests if you think you have like a certain infection or overgrowth of certain bacteria that your doctor can do to identify if you have like a problematic species or bug in there that needs to be treated and eliminated. The most common of that being H. pylori, which would be in the stomach. Different methods for sequencing or for capturing and figuring out if that's there and culturing that. But most commonly within the gut is a bacteria called Clostridium difficile. incredibly pathogenic, mostly derived from hospital infections where an individual has been on antibiotics for a long period of time and their core microbiome is kind of at a reduced capacity, and the C. diff that exists just as a part of our normal flora is incredibly opportunistic and just like explodes. And that leads to severe GI distress, malabsorption issues. C. diff diarrhea is like a huge issue, and causes a lot of complications and can even be deadly
It
if
sounds like if you're
individuals.
not absorbing nutrients and you're
Yeah,
dehydrated because
yeah.
you can't control that. Yeah, I mean, sounds like it would be brutal.
Yeah. And then the way in which we treat that is largely either through antibiotics, but sometimes it's resistant to antibiotics and we can't, it may be not even just like not traditional antibiotic resistance, but just that the antibiotics can't completely eradicate it. It
Mhm.
just doesn't knock it down entirely and it can grow back up again.
Yeah.
Um, but then the gold standard, which we kind of talked about before hopping on this call, is fecal microbiota transplantation, which is where you take the microbiome, the fecal microbiome of someone that is quote unquote healthy, and you transplant that into an individual with an active C. diff infection that is resistant to antibiotic treatment or has continually relapsed just due to treatment failure. And that seems to be one of the best methods for eradicating C. diff infection. It's just thought to be that introducing that large, densely packed microbiome into the gut is just able to suppress the level of C. diff and outcompete it to where it kind of falls back into its normal. I'm just going to kind of hang out in the back range and not overgrowth to complications.
Go
Real
ahead.
quick. So is that ingested in like pill form? Like what's the method of
You
transportation?
can do it both ways. So it can be capsulated form, but it has to be very, there are very specific methods for capsulating it where you could take a pill form and then you could also do kind of like a suppository-esque form, which would be done in a hospital, and you would have that fecal sample introduced into your colon or your upper and lower colon.
Is that
Um,
more effective?
I'm not 100. I need to read up on the research more, but just knowing about the microbiomes interactions in general, it, in my opinion, would be more effective. It's more direct. It's a more
Mhm.
direct method to get it there. If you take it in pill form, the large risks are there are people that are have kind of DIYing this at home because you can buy pill capsules that say that they're secure and like not going to release until you get to the gut. But the issue is that if it releases in the small intestine or in the stomach,
Ugh,
you are going to have like severe infection.
yeah.
You can develop SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, where you basically, we typically don't have a ton of bacteria that reside in our small intestine compared to our colon. The majority of them are within the colon. The environment in the colon is just more beneficial for those microbes to thrive. And we don't want them in the small intestine because that's where we predominantly absorb our nutrients. So like all of our macronutrients and a lot of our vitamins and minerals. And if the bacteria are there, they're competing for our enzymes with our enzymes to like metabolize and absorb nutrients. And that could lead to malabsorption, which is a complication of SIBO. So when you have your bacteria that uh, um, bloom and grow in your small intestine, it's painful, uncomfortable, and can lead to some serious complications, especially with like nutrient deficiencies. Um, so yeah, DIY at home is not recommended. And I guess it should be important because we kind of got here through C. diff to say that people aren't doing this to necessarily treat C. diff infections. A lot of them are, there was a hype several years ago, and I guess the hype is still ensuing, that there were mouse studies in which they had an obese mouse and a lean mouse, and they transplanted their microbiomes with each other. So the obese mouse got the lean mouse's microbiome through this fecal microbiota transplantation. The obese mouse lost weight. The lean mouse got transplanted with the obese mouse microbiome. The lean mouse gained weight. And so that was kind of like proof of concept that okay, these microbes are doing something for us metabolically. And that was, some of the early research with the microbiome, and looking at how it's influencing overall host metabolism and health. And people are still latching on that today to say that, okay, well, maybe our microbiome influences our weight. So I've got a skinny friend, so let's go transplant their microbiome into mine. And then it's like, okay, and then I'm going to lose weight. And then people are saying that it treats different conditions because it's just the field of microbiome is riddled, or just gut health in general is just riddled with pseudoscience. So it's a fun field to be in because you do a lot of myth busting.
Yeah. I was thinking even just with the mouse study, because I did hear a little bit of that. I was watching a talk that somebody was giving at a nutrition conference that was on YouTube,
Mhm.
and even just hearing you describe it there, it would appear to, like, the most telling evidence that I would take from swapping the two. My first thought is like, okay, you would think that the healthy person's gut microbiome would remain healthy, and that the unhealthy one would get fixed, because just like from a dilution of healthy gut microbes that are being present, you wouldn't think that these bad ones could just overrun the good ones the same way the good ones could overrun the bad ones. So I'm thinking to myself, like, that almost shows nothing.
Yeah.
Like, because I wouldn't yeah, I would think that you would want to prove that the good ones are going to continue to be good and the bad ones are going to be able to be overridden. So that just seems a little bit perplexing to me.
And that kind of goes along with why our thoughts along probiotics and their effectiveness. So in a general, like, healthy population, if you have no other underlying condition, specifically like a gastrointestinal condition, so IBS, IBDs, celiac disease, something like that, there doesn't appear to be a benefit of taking probiotics for that same reason. You're introducing, like I mentioned, you have trillions of microbes that reside in your intestines, and most of the probiotics that we can take are at best in the billion range. And when you compare billion to trillion, like, a lot of people don't realize that there is just a like logarithmic difference within that, and it's really just a drop in the bucket when you think about, okay, well, you're taking a probiotic that says it has 50 billion colony forming units in there, and okay, so how much is that compared to the microbes that are there? And if you have like a healthy population there, they're just going to suppress and not allow those that you're introducing to really take resonance or thrive, because they're very competitive. They're competitive bacteria. They're going to fight for nutrients, and those that are in greater abundance are going to do better. And it's just survival of the fittest.
Yeah. I was also thinking about, if we are evaluating the gut microbiome as it's quite funny just thinking about it, that it's arguably the most important microbiome that our body has, but it's probably the most difficult to gain access to, like, a true sample of, like you were explaining. And I don't know if you know this, because I know your emphasis has been primarily on the gut microbiome, but you're mentioning like the oral microbiome and the skin microbiome. Could those be indicators of, like, could healthy skin and oral microbiomes be indicators of a healthy gut?
That's a good question. I just, with my understanding, again, like you mentioned, it's not my area of research and not an area that I'm like super well versed in. And in comparison with the like gut microbiome, they are even younger in their like fields of research. But the one that would only make sense to me would be a correlation between your oral microbiome and your gut microbiome, just
Mhm.
due to the um, just where it exists. It's still in the gastrointestinal tract per se. But the large difference is that those environments are incredibly different. So your environment is very different from your oral and your gut environment. And so when we think of the gut, the reason it changes the density and populations of microbes, the reason they change so extensively along our GI tract, going from stomach to small intestine to large intestine. So we have very, very few microbes that exist in the stomach. That's good. We don't want a lot there. They don't thrive in the highly acidic environment, and we have a fair amount of oxygen that exists there as well. As we move into the small intestine, the acidity starts to lower, and the oxygen starts to lower. And then as you get into the colon, you have a pretty anaerobic environment, very minimal oxygen, and the pH is pretty high, or so not very acidic down there. And that's where the bulk of our microbes thrive. So environment matters. So there are definitely microbes that exist both within our mouth and within our gut that are the same species, but for the vast proportion, their populations, looking at them broadly, are going to be very different due to nutrient availability and then environmental considerations like oxygen and pH.
And then, okay, my other question was with a healthy individual who, by all metrics that we can measure, has a healthy microbiome,
Hmm.
would it, because you were saying that what is present in the feces is primarily the things that are the body's trying to excrete.
Hmm.
If somebody is eating a healthy diet, I don't even know what that means anymore, but if somebody's eating a healthy diet and as far as we can tell has a healthy microbiome, would it be safe to assume that what they are excreting is probably just an excess of what they already have, as opposed to somebody who's like got things that they actively need to be getting rid of? So like in a evaluation of a healthy stool sample, would that be the closest representation to somebody's gut microbiome we can get, or is it still not really quite that?
It's definitely like, there are mechanisms where we can take mucosal microbiome samples, but you can imagine that's basically a colonoscopy like environment, incredibly invasive. Like,
Yeah.
not most people are going to sign up to do that. So we do have like relative correlations between, okay, we think that this percentage of your stool microbiome correlates to this percentage of your core microbiome, all things considered. But there's just, I think in the field of research with humans especially, is going to have to rely on stool microbiome samples. So we're just going to have to get better at figuring out, okay, like in this specific condition or in this population, what percentage of the core microbiome is explained by the stool microbiome. So the field is largely associative, and it probably will still have to remain that way to an extent, for a lot of people, until we can get some better research evidence using people that are willing to give samples of their mucosal microbiome.
Cool.
So it's, long story short, it's probably the best measure that we have, as far as accessibility, for human assessment of the microbiome. But we have to be clear that it just has limitations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many factors. Like you talking about the mice in that study, like they're in a very controlled environment to where they're getting the same amount of food like at the same time, and like that's just not what people are doing.
Yeah, and they're all, have the same genetic background, and they're bred the same. And yeah, the environment they live in is very controlled. We even have facilities where we can study what we call germ-free mice. So mice that
Yeah, I heard about
don't
that.
have a microbiome at
Sterile
all.
mice.
Yeah, they're basically sterile.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that tells us a lot about just the role of the microbiome in various conditions, because we can study mice that have a microbiome and mice that don't have a microbiome and see how that impacts different things. And so those mice are even more tightly controlled, in which they don't, get human interaction outside of, like, they're in like a bubble and you have to mess with them in a bubble. And yeah, so we have some very regimented and controlled conditions in which we can study the microbiome, but we have to realize that it doesn't always translate.
Mm-hmm. It's a good start. I'm
Yeah, it's a good
hopeful.
start.
Yeah. Um, Another buzzword that gets thrown around is leaky gut. What is that?
And why is my gut leaking?
Yeah.
Potentially.
So leaky gut is largely what we refer to in the scientific community that studies gastrointestinal health, is, we call this intestinal permeability. So basically, the cells of our intestine are pretty tightly sealed, and don't allow much to pass through their, like, spaces between them. So we have various different proteins that seal that gut barrier. And we also have different components that participate in the gut barrier. So we have like immune cells that help mediate that. We have that mucin layer, like I was talking about, that helps kind of seal it as well. And so leaky gut really just means intestinal permeability. And the term leaky gut has been latched onto by like functional medicine and things like that, because we are able in a experimental environment, so with mice, with cell culture, and to an extent with certain very tightly controlled human populations, we can assess intestinal permeability. And there were some earlier studies that showed that like a high-fat diet in mice increased intestinal permeability. And then we know individuals that have active inflammation or issues within their gut might have an increased intestinal permeability, which basically just means that that barrier is kind of breaking down a little bit and is not as tightly sealed. And so that was the issue that exists with that largely, is our bacteria, when that's not sealed tightly, components of them can leach into circulation. And that's thought to cause inflammation throughout the body. So the most common one you'll see is called LPS, or lipopolysaccharide, also known as endotoxin. It's a component of gram-negative bacterial cell wall. It gets into circulation, and it's pretty inflammatory. So for a lot of cell culture experiments that aren't even studying like gastrointestinal stuff, they will use LPS or endotoxin as like a positive control for an inflammatory mediator, or inflammatory like insult, because it is just so inflammatory and causes so many issues. The issue with people terming it leaky gut is that we don't have any like clinical assessments to assess someone's intestinal permeability. There's nothing that's gold standard. And a lot of people they're basically telling everyone now that they have leaky gut, like these functional medicine like practitioners are telling everyone that they have leaky gut, and that the symptoms associated with leaky gut are fatigue and brain fog, and maybe you feel like bloated sometimes. And it's like, okay, well, everyone has dealt with those conditions at some
Yeah.
point. I hate when people use the term brain fog and fatigue for like describing like conditions, especially related to the gut. Because they're so like subjective. Like,
Yeah, and like you said, like a lot of this stuff just comes down to it being a snapshot. Like you could have eaten like a huge meal, like, and you're getting a big like blood glucose response, and like you could just feel like crap.
yeah,
But it doesn't mean that like you
yeah,
have to label like the post-meal feeling, oh, you must have leaky gut. It's a
yeah,
little irresponsible to do that.
yeah. They do that with SIBO too, which is why, well, it's the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. They tell everybody they have SIBO without doing the proper testing and measures to like assess it. Leaky gut is even more pervasive with like, I'm just going to tell you you have it and not going to do any tests to actually measure it, because there aren't any gold standard tests to measure it. So that's something. When people come to me and say, okay, I was told by this person that I have leaky gut, I'm like, okay, but let's like, what are we going to actually do with that information? If like, let's say you have a leaky gut, like we know certain dietary practices that are just supportive of overall GI health. We're going to target those. We're not going to like, there's no specific cure, like just like there's no diagnosis for leaky gut, there's no identified cure for it. In like even animal models too. So we just have to focus on things that we know are more supportive for an intestinal environment. And that usually gets them to like, okay, well, you're having GI issues. You were told that it's leaky gut. Let's address the other GI issues because it's not leaky gut. We don't know that you have leaky gut. So yeah.
Could you have like a leaky gut experience just after one meal that goes away immediately after? Like,
There are studies that show that certain like that our intestinal permeability can flux. There are certain like, and these are of course like cell culture and animal models, but like after certain like feeding, like certain high fat feedings, you can see a transient increase in intestinal permeability. Even after exercise, you can see an increase in intestinal permeability. Does that mean that exercise is bad and we shouldn't do it? Like, and so it's not necessarily like black and white. Like we know exercise is beneficial. Just because you see like in a laboratory setting an increase in intestinal permeability doesn't mean that your intestine is leaky for forever. Our intestinal cells can turn over relatively quickly and can repair themselves relatively quickly, which is good. They go through a lot of wear and tear with the digestive process. And so there's definitely a lot of transient effects that go on there as well, which kind of breaks down people's argument with leaky gut a little bit more.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on fasting, and does that have an impact on the gut microbiome? And I know it's different for a lot of people, but
Yeah, so with fasting in general, it's a hot topic area of research, but it comes with a lot of caveats, like everything else in nutrition. With the gut microbiome specifically, there have been no like very strong studies that have shown any long-term meaningful changes with fasting in the gut microbiome. Just like I was talking about intestinal permeability being in flux, our gut microbiome is constantly in flux. It's thought to have its own like circadian rhythm. And so kind of we'll see spikes and shifts within our bacterial population just with normal eating patterns. So you eat a meal, you have this bloom in bacteria, it kind of goes back down, and our bacteria seem to have kind of like their own rhythm that kind of is impacted by our circadian rhythm that it just exists naturally within us, but then also just our dietary patterns. So yes, you can see changes in the microbiome with basically any dietary habit change. And so if you are fasting, you can see changes in the microbiome, but typically those changes recover after you resume eating. So they don't really translate to really any meaningful difference. And then with fasting for like overall health, what everyone always touts is like the concept of like autophagy,
I just wrote that word down.
which is another thing that annoys me because a lot of people that tout it don't actually understand what it actually is. So autophagy is just a program of cell kind of like degradation to like degrade faulty components and just kind of like a mechanism of maintaining healthy cells. It's just basically like turnover. So mechanism for degrading cellular and protein material within our cells so that they can continue to function at an optimal manner. So what everyone always touts is that fasting improves autophagy, increases autophagy, so everything is just more improved. And it's just that a lot of those studies have only been done in very like tightly controlled environments, don't really translate to any meaningful outcomes. Where people with fasting, if we look at the totality of the evidence, most of the evidence that people tout for fasting is achieved to the same extent by caloric restriction. So caloric restriction in the absence of fasting is going to achieve most like often the same metabolic and health effects that just that they're touting that fasting or time restricted feeding is doing. It tends to be coming down to energy balance, which makes sense within our bodies. Like our bodies run like most of our processes are just very tightly regulated on the concept of overall energy balance. So not surprising factor that we see that caloric restriction exerts largely the same amount of effect as like a time restricted feeding with calories controlled. So there have been studies and more recently some larger scale, like I think about 100 participants, like randomized controlled clinical trials that have looked at time restricted feeding compared to those that were just allowed to like freely eat. They didn't see really any significant differences in metabolic and health outcomes. They did see that, I think the study, they did see that individuals in the time restricted feeding group actually lost more lean body mass, which is kind of a concern because we want to maintain as much lean body mass as we want to. So that's like an area of research that needs to be like studied a little bit more. So when people come to me and ask me like, is fasting, like, should I fast? It's likely not harmful. We have research that shows that it can be beneficial for certain people, but it's again, largely going to come down to like your caloric. It's just a mechanism to control calories. And some people thrive on that mechanism, and some people don't. Some people find that by restricting their feeding windows, their hunger is better controlled and their cravings are better controlled. Some people find that by restricting themselves to those feeding windows, they have like binge-like episodes and can't control their hunger, and they just like
Guilty.
are go out of, they can't do that. So people can fall into both camps. Not surprising that we have differences there, because it exists throughout an entire field of nutritional science. So with fasting, the evidence is not strong enough for me to say like it's more metabolically and overall healthy mechanism of eating. But if it works for you, it works for you. And optimally, the most optimal diet that you can follow is one that is sustainable and works for you. Even if you're not attempting to restrict your calories or anything, the best method of eating is one that fits into your lifestyle and doesn't cause you undue stress, and it can be sustainable. So,
Well, and one thing I've heard about autophagy too, is that, first of all, I've heard that it's like drinking a cup of coffee increases your autophagy.
yeah,
Like I've heard there's so many triggers for
exercise
autophagy.
does.
Yeah, and exercise.
Yeah.
And people just want to like use this fasting silver bullet of like, oh, autophagy, like it's great. But then and again, I read a lot of stuff on the internet, so I'm not going to WebMD doctor myself here, but I've heard a lot about how autophagy is like, people look at it as like this bottomless well of like, oh, I'm just going to get into autophagy like 4 or 5 times a month, and like for the next 30 years I'm going to constantly be getting the benefits of autophagy. But it's not an unlimited resource that we have access to. And I think what a lot of people do, like, and I don't know if I was hearing this in the context of like telomere length and longevity and like lifespan predictions, but there's like, I think arguably we need autophagy probably more as we age. So if you're depleting all of your resources to like utilize autophagy in your youth, we don't know if that's going to be good or bad or not.
Yeah. I
So
think
there's like
that's
so much misunderstood stuff going on with autophagy.
Yeah, and I think that's that's the like silver bullet, like with autophagy, is it's not as black and white as people want to say. Like it's not. There are studies that show that autophagy is increased in certain cancers. Like, are we going to say that that's good? Like,
Yeah.
there's nothing black and white about it. Just like there's nothing black and white about anything in science. And people tend to get like, one health guru will say like it increases autophagy, and that'll get like jumped on, and people will just kind of like regurgitate that same message. But then you also have to think about, so on top of not having long-term evidence to show that it really provides a long-term benefit, because okay, we're all correlating this with like a better longevity, better aging process, but this research is still it's young too. Like we don't have those long-term studies to see if it's okay, does this actually make a benefit in the like long-term aging process. And then also, like, if you see an increase in autophagy, what is that like? Is it statistically significant, or is it like physiologically relevant? Like there's a difference
Right.
there. Like you can find statistical significance without something truly being like clinically significant.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many confounding factors. Like if somebody
Yeah.
fasts, maybe their diet is getting better and they're more mindful of what they eat, and they started exercising with fasting, and so they're getting better sleep, and now they're like, wow, all my symptoms are gone, I feel
Yeah.
fantastic.
And that's like that's a big issue in nutrition research, is that like I've am blanking on what we actually have a term for it, but it's just like basically a domino effect of like healthy behaviors. So say you're studying like a diet intervention in a certain population, and just for the fact that they know that they're in some sort of nutrition study, whether they're in placebo or like the actual intervention group, just the fact that that they know that they're in some sort of nutrition study might make them more apt to change other healthy behaviors. So maybe they get some more movement, and maybe they drink more water, things like that. So that's something that we have to combat a lot in nutrition research as well.
Yeah. When it comes to, you were also talking about the idea of like a lot of the benefits can just be found through calorie restriction. And so like the last few days I've been, because I have to admit, I like to test on myself, even though I'm not like, so like I'll try the fasting and like I'll give it a shot, but like I don't really know what I'm doing all the time. So last few days I've been doing, I don't know if there's a name for it, but I've been
the
trying.
Brendan.
Yeah, I'm gonna name it after myself. I've been doing the like circadian biology type of eating schedule. So like when comes out, I eat. When the sun goes down, I stop eating. Just to try, because I've been hearing a lot about like people will eat for 15 hours if you let them have access to food nonstop. And I've been thinking a lot about how a lot of the decisions I make on this stuff is like, okay, well, like a million years ago, how would humans have done it?
Yeah.
I'm like, and I think to myself, like, well, okay, if I was afraid of lions in the middle of the night, I wouldn't have gone out hunting. So
Yeah.
like maybe there would have been small amounts of food, but likely I would have gotten up first light and like tried to find food for the whole day.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I've been doing it. But I think that the biggest thing I found, even just in the few days that I've been doing it so far, is that it does help me with limiting my food intake throughout the day. I know that because I'm a total, like when I do an intermittent fast and I'll just skip breakfast some days, like just because like I'm working and not thinking about it too. And I will absolutely binge at night, like terribly.
Yeah.
Like I'm the type of person who has no problem putting away like 5,000 calories in a meal, like just like no problem. And like, it's always been a struggle. So I think the caloric restriction, just as a societal perspective, like observation, is like the number one thing that people can do and don't even think about. Like, and Nick and I were talking about this earlier. There's a lot of people who want to do like, what's that one thing I need to add to my diet to fix it? And it's like, oh, maybe I need to do like a protein shake before bed because like that's going to give me all the protein I need while I'm recovering in my sleep. And it's like, maybe you just need to not be in a constant fed state in your body and like let your body just like not be digesting food. And so I found that there's been a lot of benefits to that. So when looking at the like caloric restriction, obviously, like I know that there's been a lot of research done on like severe caloric restriction, and there's a lot of negative impacts of that. But from just a regular like couple hundred calories or so deficit a day, do we see pretty substantial benefits to the gut microbiome from that in the ways that we can research, or is that pretty inconclusive at this point?
It's pretty inconclusive at this point. There are definitely like you can find studies that say anything, and basically our evidence right now is that caloric restriction can transiently modify the microbiome, but like what's going to happen if you go back to eating? It's kind of the evidence there is not super strong, and I don't really feel like I've seen too many studies that have been focused on that. So pretty cool area of research and it would be cool to study. But going along just the lines of like caloric restriction in general, like you said, we had periods of like way back where we would be fasting for long periods of time. And yeah, we have some level of like evolvement that has happened since that time. And so we, may be more optimized to eat on a more regular eating pattern now, but it's undeniable that our body does function perfectly fine with some fasting periods, and our cellular biology will speak to that. Like we have mechanisms to maintain our blood glucose and to liberate store fuels when we are in a like fasting state, or traditional, like what most people are in is like a post-absorptive state, which is like the hour like 3 to like 16, in which you would traditionally be like fasting for. A true fasting state is usually after that, but what most people think of as like fasting would be like the post-absorptive state where you start to begin liberating like the glycogen stores within your body to help mobilize some fuels. So our cellular biology does speak well to that we are well equipped to fast, even going into like long-term fasting. Like we have fat stores within our body that can keep us running for a long time. We have mechanisms to downregulate like protein, protein and amino acid metabolism, so that we can conserve as much lean body mass and tissue mass as we possibly can. And so we are equipped to do that, and our cellular biology does speak to that. And I think from the like fasting standpoint and kind of like what you were doing, like eating at sun up and eating at sundown, I think and this is just me, like just hypothesizing and thinking, I'm not
Let
a
me have it.
circadian rhythm expert, but like our bodies like routine, our bodies like rhythm, our bodies function very well on just like habit and routine. And starting your day with food probably gets you going, like it starts you off on a good end. But then most importantly, like this stopping when it gets dark outside, a lot of us don't sleep really well if we have like a lot of food on our stomach.
I
You
get
may have some
nightmares.
like, yeah, you may have some reflux, you may have some different dreams, you may feel uncomfortable and distended and just not like you can't sleep very well. And we know that sleep has a huge impact on our overall health. And so like what percentage of like of benefit is explained by just the fact that maybe you're sleeping better, because you're
Yeah.
not going to bed and having nightmares, or having like reflux in the middle of the night because you ate too much food right before you went to bed. So I definitely think there's a lot of like practical relevance in that, but I do think, going back to the like main comment, that a lot of our like beneficial health outcomes in nutritional science are driven by the overall like concept of caloric restriction or energy balance. Most everything can be explained by that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, in all types of health, I feel like the placebo is such an important factor that I know it's more so on the rise and like being utilized and really being emphasized now. But like, I feel like with this, just since it is so diverse and personalized to each person, like with nutrition, like the placebo is so important in just really motivating people to keep healthier habits.
Yeah, placebo effect is a huge thing, and like you can truly feel like benefits from anything because you can convince yourself that you feel benefits from it. The mind is like a crazy powerful tool, and that's especially prevalent in like GI issues, because our gut and our brain are innervated and connected through various mechanisms. So like stress can impact your GI symptoms, but you can also stress yourself out about having GI symptoms and then give yourself GI symptoms from thinking it's like uh, the mental aspect that comes into play there is pretty strong, especially when it comes to the gut.
Hmm. Yeah, so there is a pretty significant crossover with like mental health and gut health.
Yeah, there is. It's called, so we have, it's been termed the gut brain axis. So our gut is connected to our brain through various different mechanisms. One largely being the like physical connection of the vagus nerve. And we also have what's called our enteric nervous system, which is essentially the nervous system that helps with like our gastrointestinal motility, and things like that. And so our GI tract is very much innervated and connected to our nervous system. And another communication in which the gut communicates with the brain is through the production of different neurotransmitters, and different things like that, and through the production of those short chain fatty acids, which are thought to have impacts there as well. But again, this area of research is not super well understood. My husband, during his PhD, so we got our PhDs in the same field. He was both doing gut microbiome research, but he was doing it with Alzheimer's disease, looking at does seem to be an interaction between the gut microbiome and Alzheimer's disease. And so he was studying that in rodents, giving them MRI scans and a little tiny mouse MRI,
That's
and
awesome. So
looking at
cute.
changes in the microbiome and with different dietary methods, and seeing if that improved Alzheimer's disease. But sadly, Alzheimer's disease is not, most research, especially in the nutrition field, with Alzheimer's disease has come up like empty-handed.
Mm.
It's a really terrible condition that's just not well understood at all, and treatments don't seem to work. And if they work for one person, it doesn't seem that they're going to work for the other person. And yeah.
All right, we're sending me down an Alzheimer's rabbit hole now. So I have two questions now. One, the terminology being used, I've heard on multiple occasions of Alzheimer's being type 3 diabetes.
Mhm.
Is that fairly, like, is there pretty stable evidence to support that it's got something to do with like overconsumption of carbohydrates and the inability, like there's something, and I'm going to get my my like hormones and everything wrong here, but something about like your body's inability to, or your brain's inability to continue to like shuttle insulin properly. And like, so then insulin or one of the other chemicals that our body produces cannot get in, no longer can get into the brain to help pull the like blood sugars out of our brain. And like there's something going on there. Like I don't know how much you know about that, because it may be
It's not a lot at all. I will admit that I don't know a lot about the like type 3 diabetes, but I
like I
do
said, it's a
know that
rabbit hole.
yeah, I do know. And my husband's, and I forget what he actually studied an aspect of that for his dissertation, which shows how much I paid attention. But
He had your own work on, don't worry.
there is like, you are correct in the term that they do like, we do see like glucose control issues in patients that have Alzheimer's disease fairly frequently, to the point in which it's been termed type 3 diabetes. I don't know a lot about the like pathology and like etiology of it though, with what exactly is going on. So I won't even try to
No
guess.
worries, no worries.
Yeah.
We'll stop my rabbit hole there then. Yeah. Not get too off topic.
I know this is a topic that Brendan brought up with me a little earlier. But thinking more on like a macro level and like a sociological level, what is it, do you think, about people really like joining these groups or communities, like a carnivore diet or like a keto or vegan, and like really being all in that?
I have a theory on this too.
It's we thrive on having support systems. Like, it's the reason people do well on some of those diets is because they have that support system. And we thrive on like social aspects, especially like right now, where all of us are like isolated essentially from a lot of people. Even on like the online community, it might be helpful to have like a message board for your like carnivore friends, where you can talk about, different issues. And there is a large mental aspect to like dieting and having that support system. And sometimes people just want people to talk to, and like it can be incredibly therapeutic just to have someone to talk to. So I do think, yeah, I don't know exactly what question you were getting at. I can't remember exactly what question you were getting at, but there is a large like support system component to those groups for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I might dig in on it a little bit further too. And I'm curious, I'll give you my stance on it, and then I would love to hear yours. So my stance on it is that all of the things that make somebody become a vegan and love it, and become a carnivore and love it, because those are the two extremes of the spectrum at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think they're achieving the exact same thing, which is cutting out a lot of the garbage foods.
Mm-hmm.
And I think on top of that, and this is actually a newer like thought that had been exposed to me. And so I was just hearing about this idea that, and like we were talking about, your body's got these mechanisms intentionally. Like we evolved to be able to eat, like we clearly have people who can eat vegan and people who can eat carnivore. I think we can all probably do both.
Mm-hmm.
And our body's designed to be able to fluctuate back and forth. But what may be happening is when people go full like carb heavy for such a long time, they shut off some of the mechanisms of like their fat metabolism maybe, and like being able to like tap into a ketogenic state at some points in time, because evolutionarily like we likely needed to. And when people go full blown carnivore, it's not that they're like finding some like revolutionary thing. It's just they're reactivating their ability to then tap into that as well. And then they're able to like bounce back and forth. And I know there's a lot of autoimmune stuff that goes on that, the carnivore diet's been really proven to be helpful with. And I personally include meat in my diet because I think there's a lot of benefits to having, I don't know if you're familiar with Butcher Box, but I like try and keep my meat quality like very high quality as often as I can. But yeah, I think that there's something that we've gotten to the extremes, I think, to bring us back to the middle, which is like, we need to be exercising both ends of this spectrum of like, again, I like to go evolutionarily. Like if we came across a bush full of berries when we were out, like looking for food, we probably just like ate all of them. you know,
Yep.
and then we hunted and we like caught an animal or whatever, and like we just ate that. And so I think we just have these systems that are able to go back and forth, and people want to, like, again, to use the term silver bullet, like people want to find the one thing, but like, I don't know that long-term forever keto is like the best thing. And we definitely don't know, because there's definitely not been
Yeah.
research.
Mm-mm. Yeah.
And on the other hand, like we see a lot of health issues that come up with people who tend to go vegan. Like there's vitamin deficiencies. I know B12 is a huge one. So I just think that like people want to find these things, and we're somewhere in the middle. And I think evolutionarily we can find evidence for like we're probably somewhere in the middle.
Oh yeah. Evolutionarily speaking, we can function on both ends of the spectrum really well. And it's like you said, it's probably not optimal to focus to like function on only one end of the spectrum for the entirety of your life, because we have these mechanisms in place to ship back and forth for a reason. And I don't know how strong the evidence is that if that we should be using them a certain amount of time. We should be using more uh, you know carbohydrate degradation pathways and metabolism pathways versus more fat metabolism pathways, but I don't think there's evidence to suggest that. But um, there is evidence like to suggest that we can use both perfectly fine. And like you mentioned, both the vegan group, ethics aside
Mhm.
from this whole talk, if we're just talking about overall health, so like ethics, environmental factors
Yeah.
aside,
Yeah.
if we're just
That's
talking about like
man.
health concerns, and dietary concerns, they're both yelling the same thing,
Yes.
but wanting the same goal.
Mhm.
And like you mentioned, most of them are just eliminating those like ultra processed foods, which we can pretty much all agree like they can fit into a healthy diet. But should we be relying on like
Yeah.
ultra processed foods for the entirety of our diet? No. And I would argue, like going down a rabbit hole, or off on a tangent and hopping up on my soapbox, I hate
Do
the
it.
term plant-based diet. I absolutely hate it. I think it's a dumb term, because the majority of us, aside from those of us that are eating a carnivore diet, the majority of us, no matter what we eat, even if you're eating an ultra processed food diet, you are eating a diet that is arguably plant-based.
Mhm.
Like most of that food has come from plants. So aside from those of us that, or not those of us, I don't eat a carnivore diet, but aside from the people that eat a carnivore diet, most of us just naturally are going to eat a plant-based diet no matter what. And so I hate the term plant-based because I know what they're getting at. They're getting at a more vegan-based diet.
Mhm.
But I
Well, the
think
term now is whole foods plant-based diet.
okay,
That's the
okay.
new way of saying it, I guess. But still, yeah, I mean, I
But
get what you're
still,
saying.
that would describe my way of eating, and I include meat in my diet. Like
Yeah.
I eat eggs and dairy and meat products, and
Mhm.
I still arguably would eat more plants and more whole food plants than I would like meat products, which I mean, I think most people can achieve pretty easily without putting a lot of like thought into it, because most of our food system and like products that we have that are available for purchase, whether they're whole food or processed, are somehow plant-based.
Yeah, I
But
like that. Um, I want to talk too about like as we talk about all these different fad diets, I think another thing that comes up very often in my mind is different types of like social stigma around food. Um, and like this idea that you like have to be managing your weight and like your food intake because you have to manage your weight. And like I get that like, you know, lean body mass is like an indicator of health, but there's so many indicators for health. Um, and as we were talking about um, the idea of having like a caloric restriction as part of your meal plan in some ways, I was thinking a lot about like, so we're in California, so like people are pretty progressive out here, but we even get a pretty serious push for like especially young kids. And I don't know if this has anything to do with it, and I'm kind of dipping into Nick's realm here in psychology, but we do a lot of pushing like, oh, you got to eat up, you got to be big and strong, like, and we send this message of like eat. um and we're not making any like significant progress on this obesity epidemic that's going on through this country. So where do you find that like this social stigma piece is like failing most people, and like how do you maybe look at your role in like as a teacher and as a dietitian to like kind of have a positive impact on people's like relationships with food? Because I know that that's an important
Yeah.
part of your story too.
Yeah. And so I do, like, in my like own personal philosophy with nutrition, I tend to fall more into like what people would term like intuitive eating. So I don't actively track calories. I don't, actively track macronutrients that I'm eating. I may, reflect on like, okay, what do I think I ate that day? Kind of like, what am I eating enough? Am I not, am I eating too much? Am I getting enough protein? I may assess those type of things, but in general, I fall into like more of the intuitive eating realm, which, to get at your like mention about children and growing up, we are born intuitive eaters. We know when we're hungry and we know when we're full. And what we do throughout our lives, just due to societal influences, the way in which we've been grown up to, in my household, not to like bash my parents, it was just a common thing, but like we had the clean plate club. And so like you were supposed to like clean your plate, and it wasn't like something that they made you do, but it was like we had that terminology, like
Yeah,
you're a
and
member of the clean plate club.
I think it's
And
important to
it's,
just
yeah.
mention too with that is that like a lot of these things that I was just explaining are super well intentioned. Like nobody's
Yeah.
trying to
Oh
be
yeah.
like mean about them, but
Yeah.
maybe we're just a little misguided, I guess.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
then
sorry.
you also have to think about the factor, okay, like, well, we don't want to waste food, but like also we don't need to be force feeding ourselves in the like just because we don't want to waste food kind of thing. But like we are all born intuitive eaters. We know how to feed ourselves and stop when we get when we get full. And just throughout life, there are so many different factors, like those experiences in childhood, just like cultural factors and societal factors, like the just food environment, and like complete like advertisements for food that are everywhere, the just ease of food access. We can override those signals throughout our lifetime to where we don't really know how to sense when we're truly hungry and when we're truly full. And so that can cause issues with overall energy balance, because when those mechanisms are well functioning, they're well functioning because our bodies can sense when we need food and when we don't need food. And they can generally regulate our body weight and energy balance pretty effectively. And so my own philosophy is trying to get back to that and trying to focus on that. But I do recognize, and I work with people that have goals of weight loss, and it's completely a valid choice. And there are ways in which we can do that healthier. Not, you don't have to be on a restrictive diet. You don't have to track your calories. You don't have to track your macronutrients. Like, can we just do some basic education on like what a healthy, like building a healthy plate, making balanced meals, assessing your hunger and fullness cues, and things like that. And so I do think that like the societal factor and like social cultural factor has played like a huge role in the current status of overall like metabolic health that exists in the US, outside of an individual's BMI or body weight, because we know that metabolic health can be poor in individuals with a healthy body weight, and it can be perfectly fine in individuals that we would classify as obese. Like nothing there is black and white either. So yeah, I'm rambling now. So
Sorry, I rambled for the whole question. So
But it's all relevant.
yeah,
Like on a societal level and a structural level, there does seem like there's a better push towards healthier habits. But still, like you're saying, the education isn't really there. Like I didn't know anything about really healthy eating or just health in general, kind of, and that's a privilege. But until I was like in the last 5 years of my life, I feel.
yeah. And I don't know what they teach in school now, because I feel like it's changed so much. Like math is a completely different subject now, apparently, in like elementary school. They do division way differently than we all learned. But I don't know what they're teaching in health class, but we certainly, like, we were learning the food pyramid back when I was in health class. And I mean, I don't know, we maybe spent like a day on it, and it's just like not very helpful. Like,
Mhm.
I don't know. It's kind of like how I wish they taught you about taxes in school, and we got those like we need more life skill development in school. Not, we don't need to
definitely.
all learn trigonometry or calculus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because then there's these, I totally see the positive benefits of these communities of being like a vegan or being a carnivore diet. But then there's these like extremes of these diets to where I feel like some people who aren't informed, they say, oh, maybe I should try this. It looks like it has positive benefits. And you don't know what you're really getting into. And then that might have negative effects as well. And
Yeah.
so this
If you don't,
misinformed
and
piece.
yeah, and if you don't know you don't know the full story of what you're getting into in terms of the diet itself, like what micronutrient deficiencies are you going to have to watch out for? Like if you're on a vegan diet, what other components you might have to watch, like both of those like extreme diets have micronutrient deficiencies and complications that can arise from them. If you're not informed of it, there's an issue. Like you're not leading yourself down like a dangerous hole. The other aspect is not being able to, or having someone to help you assess the mental aspect that might come along with that. Some people have a greater propensity for development of an eating disorder. And now we know that it's not in the DSM-5, but it probably will be in the future, like the classification of orthorexia. So that extreme obsession with just healthy eating to where it becomes unhealthy. And so that I feel like a lot of individuals in both the carnivore camp and the vegan camp, that those type of extreme diets can put you at risk for that. And just eating disorders in general. If you don't understand your own basic like mental status going into those, and your propensity for kind of like very OCD-like behaviors, and getting very fixated on things. People that are very type A are more at risk for eating disorder development of those kinds too. And so I think there it's important to be fully informed, like, hey, you need to keep tabs or have someone help you keep tabs on your mental status as you're going through this, if this is truly something you want to go through. So.
Yeah, and that's something that I'm happy that we're moving more towards in healthcare in general, is a more collaborative team, so that we can have somebody who is an expert on like nutrition and dietetics, and then work with a counselor or a medical doctor, and hopefully support the whole person rather
Yeah,
than
for
just
sure.
like a 15-minute check-in.
Yeah, it's hard because you got to see so many people, and even dietitians will tell you a lot of times in the clinical setting, people don't want to hear from us. They're just like, you're just going to tell me to like cut out fast food. Like you're going to tell me to like reduce my calories and get some more exercise, and not really the case. But we have to combat the factor that people don't want to hear what we have to say. And oftentimes we don't have a lot of time with patients. A lot of dietitians have the same amount of time that, doctors have. You got to run in, assess, get done what needs to get done, and leave. You really get in the outpatient setting is where you get that one-on-one time with an individual, both from a doctor standpoint and a dietitian standpoint.
Yeah.
When you talk about these, like when you're like prescribing a nutritional intervention for somebody, and like with a goal of, whatever that may be, maybe it's because they have some micronutrient deficiencies and they need to like help revert those, or somebody just wants to do regular weight loss. What do you find, and this could just be observational for you, what do you find being like the number one limiter to adherence to any of these diets? Because I feel like that's got to be one of the biggest and most difficult hurdles to overcome, is that people just can't stick to it.
Yeah, I think, and it's probably way more mixed than this, and a lot of people probably have different feelings, and it's definitely different in our current environment. But the aspect of just what people will lose from the like social aspect of food if they have to be on a restrictive diet. The like social aspect, like food is very social. Like nobody will argue that, and a lot of people, like most people, will argue that that's not a bad thing. Like it's a way that we connect and bond with each other. And individuals that are on like restrictive diets, they have issues with like engaging in those social aspects of food, which then if we want to go back to like mental health aspects, the isolation itself could push you into eating disordered eating territory if you're isolating yourself because you don't feel like you can engage in certain food behaviors. And so I'm not someone that would personally ever put someone on like a restrictive diet for like caloric reasons. But there are people that I've worked with that have to be on like an example, like a low FODMAP diet for GI conditions, which is a like phased diet approach, where they have to have like an elimination phase where they remove all these FODMAPs from their diet, which FODMAPs, it's an acronym that stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. Basically just means fermentable carbohydrates that cause a lot of GI distress in certain individuals. So mainly working with individuals that have GI issues. So you would remove most all FODMAPs and then slowly introduce them later, like after a few weeks of like a removal, to see which ones you really have an issue with. And that's a really hard one for people to do. It's not meant to be long term, so that's something that you have to tell them too. It's like, this is like 8 to 12 weeks, short period of your life. We're going to figure it out. There's probably only 1 or 2 food groups that or foods that you are like sensitive to and that are causing you a lot of GI distress. We're going to figure out what that is. You can engage in social activities and easily avoid these foods without having the GI ramifications. So keeping in mind that like end goal, and having that close contact with someone. And that's why I think not trying to like always DIY your own diet, or like especially like medical based diets, because there's a lot that you can see from an outside perspective, that when you're just in your own head, you may not be seen. And there's a lot of value in having someone evaluate you as a person and say, have you thought about this? And kind of assessing for both eating disorder and disordered eating behaviors, but just assessing how you're doing as a whole person. Like, are you taking care of your social health? Are you taking care of your mental health? And things like that too.
Yeah, I think, and that reminds me a lot about some of the things that I think are the most important about the blue zones. Because I think a lot of people, I'm not going to pin this on one camp or the other, like to talk about the blue zones and their health benefits nutritionally. But there's like 7 pillars of the blue zones. Only one of them is nutrition. And, it's a very epidemiological approach to just pin it on, and which is a valuable approach, but it has its flaws. And to pin, a nutritional recommendation based on what could be 7 other things, which I think community is one of the biggest ones.
Yeah.
And physical activity. Yeah, I think it's so important, and people often overlook the importance. And we were even talking to a sports, well, he's not a sports psychologist, I don't think. Is he, Brennan?
No.
Okay. He's just an MFT, but we were talking to him, and he teaches a course on like working through loss of sports for athletes, and like going through that grieving process of losing your sport and your identity in that. And one of the things we talked about was the most important thing is as you're about to progress through that, you need to make sure you have your support system there set up ready for you. And I think going through, like you're saying, these are highly social experiences where people are experiencing food, and to feel like you're having to strip something away can almost in its own way be a loss. And I think that if we don't have a proper support system ready to help us navigate that, I think it's like you need to integrate your social environment into the meal plan. And I think that sounds so intuitive to people, but it's also at the same time like so hard to do, because people don't want to be like, oh yeah, like I'm doing my FODMAPs and I can't have all those fermentable carbohydrates. So, and it's like, but if people just talk to the people that are close to them, they're probably like, cool, let's do it. Like, I'm not going to let you eat those things. Like I'm right there. So I think that community piece is so, like, it's talked about, but not nearly enough as the other stuff. And to me, it goes right back to the message you push of just, this can't be a stress in your life. If you're going to stress about it, again, that brain gut connection is going to completely counteract any positive influences you're going to try and do nutritionally, because you're just going to throw that stress into some other weird reaction. So yeah, I think the community piece is probably the number one thing that people overlook when it comes to like trying to get these nutritional changes down.
Yeah, it's such a strong component, that like support system is huge. And that's the reason you see like, that's one of the main reasons like why Weight Watchers has been around for so long. Like, you get that community aspect there. Is the diet they prescribe that great? No, not really. Like, it's it's a little weird, and it still comes down to like the overall concept of like caloric restriction and
Right.
energy balance, but like you get that community, and that can be incredibly helpful for some people.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, and I always say that like the diet should fit into your lifestyle. You shouldn't have to fit your lifestyle into the diet. Like you should be able, the diet that works for you is the diet that you can sustain both at an individual level, but also at like a social level where it's not interfering with other aspects of your life. If you can't sit down and eat with your, if you have kids, like eat a meal with your family, like I have a concern. But if you can't eat like a meal with your family just because you're on this highly restrictive diet, yes, if you have medical issues and you're on a medical, like medically prescribed diet, you you might have some issues, but there's still ways to get around that where you can still engage in like a normal eating pattern with sitting down at a table with your family. That social aspect is so often ignored, and it's a huge component in like overall mental health. And it just plays a large role in the food environment.
Mhm. Yeah, and with that too, like even if it's still a significant stressor on your mind and you do choose to sit down and eat that meal, if it's still something that's really bothering you, then you're going to feel that guilt after, and
Yeah.
that's like can be so detrimental as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of segueing from this topic, I know that this is something that you've kind of touched on with us before, but how do you see the impact of social media uh, on like well-being and health?
It can go both ways. I hope now that those of us that are combating misinformation are going to be able to kind of be a louder voice. And that's been especially prevalent like with the pandemic, seeing these like scientific researchers and people that are like medical professionals come out and educate the public on vaccines and on the pandemic and on public health. It can be like a great tool for like a positive tool. And I feel like historically it's been more negative, where we compare our lives to each other, everything that we eat, everything that we share, and we forget that it's a highlight reel of people's lives, and that can be a severe issue for your own mental health if you're thinking that, well, this person did X, Y, and Z, and I'm just a crappy person because this is all I did today. I just sat on the couch and did nothing. When they don't show the days that they sat on the couch and did nothing, and ate fast food and things like that. But I feel like social media is becoming more transparent, and it might just be who I surround myself with and things like that, who are echoing kind of the same sentiments. But I do hope that that is kind of a more broad trend, and that it's being used for educational, as an educational platform by people that are qualified to give education, the material on that specific topic, and that it's becoming more transparent and helpful. So yeah, I'm optimistic about social media moving forward, and I hope that it continues to be a way in which we can connect with each other, but a way in which we can communicate important information, and help get important information to people that really need it.
Yeah, I think that I'm kind of feeling the same thing that you just expressed, in that we're definitely on this trend of like, and I think it happens with a lot of stuff, but like, people will try and manipulate these like new systems right out the gate. And it's really easy to just like write them off because these like, bad apples have like
Hmm.
infiltrated social media.
Yeah.
But I don't think we can just like write it off because, there's people putting really good information out there. And I think, a positive form of confirmation bias is kind of like what you expressed. Like you're surrounding your people with like-minded positive people in that way. And like, I think we just all need to get to this point where like we just stop following the people that are destructive
Yeah.
to our like mental health,
Yeah.
and just like try and find those like ecosystems of like really good people. I think, this just occurred to me, and maybe, if Instagram or Twitter is listening, maybe put like a mental health approved follow icon that's kind of like
Pretty
like a
cool.
green check mark. Green, we need to get green check marks out there for
I
people
like
who
that.
are pushing positive messages so that you can, push aside all the other people. But yeah,
That'd be cool.
I think there's a really good trend of more positivity, an educational approach to social media that I think, like you're saying, spreads really valuable
Yeah.
information. So yeah, I'm optimistic as well about the uses of social media.
Yeah. Sorry. My dog has heard a door shut and now she's freaking out.
No
Oh,
worries.
no.
I actually wanted, do you have another question on that topic? I was going to segue again.
No, I was just
Actually, I was
gonna
going to jump back to
definitely jump back. I was just gonna say I think that's why I really appreciated your content, like especially on Instagram, because there is so much information packed just within like your own profile, and it's awesome to have like such easy access to someone who's studied so much in a specific field. So yeah,
And I've
thanks for.
always, my philosophy with like nutrition and research and things like that is my PhD was largely funded by grants, and grant funding comes largely, in my instance, and in most people's instances, from the government. And so from taxpayer dollars. And so I feel like an obligation to give back, at least in some way, to like communicate like important messages, because to be honest, like indirectly, my PhD was funded by taxpayer money, essentially.
Mhm.
I went to a state school and I was funded under grants. So I've always felt like that large responsibility, because the research that we're doing is is funded by the public and intended to help the public. And if we're not taking the extra step in communicating that information to the public, we're doing a disservice, because those are the people we're supposed to be serving. Otherwise, we're just serving other scientists and just telling them, hey, I found this. This might be cool. You might like this kind of thing.
Mhm.
Mm. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. I wanted to ask too about your perspective going back to the microbiome on the use of antibiotics. And, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I I definitely am aware that like heavy use of antibiotics can be really detrimental on our gut microbiome. So I guess my question is more about like how do we find a balance of like antibiotic use and like maintaining good health by preventing ourselves from getting diseases, and on top of that, how, if we have to take antibiotics, are there some things that we can do to really like rebolster our microbiome quickly?
Yeah, so antibiotics are absolutely wonderful, and when they're needed, and so they're definitely something that has we would be we would be here if we didn't have antibiotics. I don't know. Like there's a lot of fascinating history in the use of antibiotics and what
Mhm.
they've saved us from, essentially. Um, but the like you mentioned, the issue is when you're taking something orally that is antibiotics, so killing uh, bacteria, essentially. It obviously is going to have an impact on your gut microbiome, and we see that. Like you can both in animal studies and in human studies, you can see that it will significantly knock down populations of bacteria within your gut, and that's going to be dependent on what type of antibiotic you're using. If it's a broad spectrum antibiotic, if it's a targeted antibiotic, what percentage of the bacterial population are you actually impacting? um, but the I guess the nice thing is that our microbiomes tend to be pretty resilient, and they tend to, after antibiotic exposure, tend to relatively quickly, within a few weeks or so, repopulate themselves back to what our core microbiome would be. The issue comes along with if you have that chronic antibiotic use, which used to be more of a problem, because they used to just throw antibiotics on everything because they were just this miracle drug. Um, and so that's where we see where we would have more of a concern on an individual's microbiome, is if you're chronically throwing antibiotics onto the gut microbiome. But so for those of us that just have to be on an antibiotic because we have a bacterial infection and we really want it to go away, we know that there are some GI effects that come alongside with antibiotic use. A lot of times, many people have like antibiotic induced or antibiotic associated diarrhea. There is some evidence that probiotics, specific probiotics, can help with some of that, just symptomatically. There's not a lot of evidence that an individual should take a probiotic alongside an antibiotic. It seems a little futile to be trying to throw bacteria onto something you're putting in that kills bacteria. And there isn't a lot of evidence that you should take a probiotic after finishing a course of antibiotics. There was a really neat study a few years back that showed that individuals who actually utilize a probiotic after taking an antibiotic, it took them longer to restore their normal bacterial population.
Wow, that is
Probably
interesting.
just due to you're throwing different bacteria in there that are competing for nutrients, not allowing to your core to really thrive. And so the best thing that most people can do after and within taking antibiotics is to consume a good amount of prebiotics, which just means eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, fiber, like whole grains, beans, legumes, if you can handle it. Eat the level in which you handle. You don't need to go eat like 50, 60, 80 grams of fiber, but making sure that you're getting adequate levels of fiber in your diet to help those bacteria that are there, that as they start to repopulate, that's their metabolic fuel for most of them, and to help them kind of like reestablish and repopulate. So really the best thing is just to get back into like a normal eating pattern that includes a good chunk of prebiotic fiber.
And then it makes me think too about, because you mentioned the fiber piece, and you may not be familiar yet because this whole carnivore thing's pretty new,
Yeah.
but like, it's kind of fascinating that they're like, in some cases, and I don't know what their microbiomes look like, they could be devastated, but what do you maybe hypothesize is going on with somebody who's getting zero fiber?
I don't foresee, and I feel like most GI researchers would agree with me that they don't think that that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Like we know that fiber has so many benefits. And yeah, because they're eating carnivore, they're not eating like a lot of carbohydrates. So, you don't necessarily need the fiber for the like blunting the blood glucose response in that instance, but fiber has other healthy effects too. And I've not seen any research on it yet, but I can't imagine their microbiomes have to look vastly different. They're going to shift largely. So we have a lot of like carbohydrate fermenters and protein fermenters. So carbohydrate fermenters are going to do a lot of the fiber metabolism. Protein fermenters are going to metabolize and break down that protein. Fat, we do have some bacteria that can metabolize fat, but fat is kind of the macronutrient that our bacteria aren't like, they're not actively like looking to break down for the most part. We prefer like a carbohydrate and protein. They tend to prefer that, or they predominate on those two. And so you most likely will see a rapid shift, an upregulation in your protein fermenters. So your protein metabolizing bacteria, which they do produce like a pretty wide range of gases, but we do see a lot of, and this is me just like talking hypothetically about what could possibly happen. But like our protein fermenters that produce all of these gases are associated more so with like an unhealthy microbiome distribution, and they're associated with more GI issues and GI conditions. So right now it's not really, we don't really think it's beneficial to have like a high protein fermenting capacity within the gut. And there is some research that suggests that even like with a high protein diet, so that would like make you think, so should I not be eating a lot of protein? With a high protein diet that also includes a high amount of fiber, you're able to like blunt that gas gas production that comes alongside with that. And it's thought to be beneficial. So that's an argument for the incorporation of fiber with a diet that's high in protein as well. And that's, satiety aspect aside. So I just don't foresee, that's one of my largest complaints with like the carnivore diet, is not that you're not eating like traditional carbohydrates, not that you're just eating meat, but that like you are saying that fiber is not necessary. I don't foresee that going well, and I wouldn't want to live in the same household as you if that was if you were eating a carnivore diet. I can't imagine that goes well.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things too, like when I am, sitting back behind my keyboard and like watching and reading stuff about nutrition, one of the things I see a lot is almost always a red flag for me is if somebody's only recommending one diet or saying there's one diet for somebody or whatever. And that's actually, obviously there's going to be tons of controversy about this because he is kind of like, I don't know if you are familiar with Paul Saladino. He was on Joe Rogan and he like got a lot of press about his carnivore stuff.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the name, but I've not looked into him too much.
Yeah. I mean, I watched the Joe Rogan interview. He has a couple interesting thoughts on his podcast, but the one thing I have to say about him that I really appreciate is he openly admits all the time that this is not an ideal diet for everybody, and like everybody needs to figure out what's right for them. And he's got an autoimmune disorder. Maybe that makes it something right for him. And it's not any, I think it's like eczema or something,
Yeah.
like not something super severe, but finding the diet that works for you. And he actually incorporates a lot of like honey, and he's experimented with white rice.
Yeah.
So he's not being so dogmatic about this, which is usually a good sign for me that like, okay, he's trying to really objectively look at this. But one of the like most highly cited modern populations of people to look back, like from an ancestral standpoint, as to where like how we could potentially model our old way of eating and living is a group called the Hadza in Africa. And they eat their favorite food, no doubt, they have been asked, because people have gone and studied them, is when they can hunt something.
Yeah.
That's what they prefer. But they have so many of what Dr. Saladino refers to as fallback foods. Like we don't have these foods that just like we don't have Whole Foods. We can't just go buy whatever we want in high quantities all the time. So
Yeah.
I think even in the research from both sides, there's a lot of evidence that they eat almost like a high starchy, like fibrous root of a tree as one of their primary secondary foods. And it just like makes so much sense that like high protein and fiber, like it's naturally in their diet. Like you just said it, they're seeing it. Like, I feel like a lot of this stuff is so evident that like, we can do both. Like,
Yeah.
why are we
Yeah.
being so, one-sided on this? So,
And I fully agree with the aspect that there is no one diet that fits anybody. There are medically graded diets that are very appropriate for specific people, and those diets would not work at all for some other people. Like there are just lifestyle based diets that work great for some people, and then some people are like, I would go crazy on that diet. Like it's silly to think that there's like this one diet that people could eat for just like overall health, because health is not just your like internal metabolic health. It's also like your physical, like your, like how much can you exercise, like do you have the energy to exercise, because some people on the ketogenic diet sometimes feel like crap in some instances where they don't have that rapid energy from carbohydrates. You can adapt to that, but like that a reason why a lot of people quit. But what is your mental health like? What is your social health like? It's absolutely silly to think that there's like this one diet that is just like the gold standard. Everyone should eat it.
yeah. And I'm sorry, I was halfway down a point and like got myself on a tangent a second ago.
I relate.
But what you were saying about if somebody's going too hard on like this keto or carnivore, let's say, and they're cutting out a lot of the fiber, I mean, it would make sense too that they're also like, and you said that protein digesting enzymes in their gut microbiome are going to be like they're going to overproduce and they're going to underproduce. And it just makes sense, like with this whole idea that we need the metabolic flexibility to bounce back and forth between what we're consuming. Is like and I think this could be something that we see, unfortunately, in like long term, is like if people are going like 5, 10, 15 years, now if they're willing to sustain that for their entire life, then by all means, like I'm sure they're going to be okay. Like if they can continue to get all their other micronutrients and all that. But the minute they try and bounce back and try and digest something, it's going to not only like probably not go well because they're not going to have enough of the stuff in their gut to like digest it, but it's also going to be like a negative confirmation that they can't eat that. But really they've just underdeveloped their flexibility to go back and forth.
Yep. We see that with people that have from like a more rapid standpoint, our digestive enzymes will like flux and downregulate. If you're not needing the enzymes to like help digest certain foods because you're not eating those foods, your body's just not going to continue, like it's not going to waste energy producing stuff that you don't need. And so things can upregulate, but it takes time. And so like if individuals go and take those food sensitivity tests that are not valid, you can't, that's a whole nother tangent, but they're basically told a bunch of foods that they can't eat. And it is, in this instance, it's confirmation bias, because the tests that they're taking are testing for an IgG antibody, which is a like memory marker, which basically just means, hey, you've eaten that food relatively in the, at some point, or relatively in the, kind of recently. And so people with GI issues will take those tests and be like, oh, it says I'm sensitive to eggs. I eat eggs every single day. No wonder why I feel sick. And it's like, no, you were testing for the foods that you actually eat. But then also, if an individual goes further down and follows that dietary recommendation, if they are sensitive to whatever food and they completely eliminate it from their diet, say it's like gluten and they completely eliminate that from their diet, and then one day down the road, they decide to reintroduce it and give it a shot, and they feel like absolute crap after introducing it because they're not digesting it well. Confirmation bias. Like, you're like, see, I was actually
Yeah.
sensitive to it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Man,
So then
it's
this
complex.
this takes me down a whole nother route about like supplements.
Yeah.
And I tend to lean towards like whenever possible to not need to supplement. Because I think there's like, for example, like digesting protein from meat versus like getting a powder.
Yeah.
Like I think there's cofactors with the meat that probably are beneficial in like the digestive process. Where do you like, we call them supplements as a society for probably a very particular reason, but where do you stand on supplements?
My stance is like they should not be replacing your like normal dietary patterns. There are instances in which they can be helpful, like we were talking about vegans with B12 deficiency. Like most vegans will need like certain micronutrient supplements, including like B12. It's just something that's naturally going to be deficient in their diet. Some people will naturally need to supplement with iron in certain like iron deficiencies. Some people, like if an individual is planning to be pregnant, they will need folic acid or folate. And that helps prevent neural tube defects. So there's a lot of instances in which supplementation may be more necessary, but for most people, supplements should not take over, and like you shouldn't pop a multivitamin and then go eat like fast food all day because you're like, well, I got my vitamins and minerals covered because I took a multivitamin this morning. No, they should be there to like correct for any deficiencies or supplement your diet. And then kind of in like the sports realm, like maybe you have a really hard time eating a level of protein at which you like would be beneficial for your like strength goals or athletic goals or whatever, because we do know that athletes do need a little more protein. And maybe you just can't naturally do that and you add in a protein shake. Like, okay, fine, you're just not, as long as you're not eating that as your only source of protein, I'm fine with that. And then like creatine, pretty well evidence-based research supplement for athletes, like perfectly fine to add that in, but is it going to make like a world of difference? Probably not. And so for most people, like you don't have to waste your money with supplements, but they can be helpful in certain conditions. And I typically don't recommend people to like go out and take vitamin and mineral supplements without having a defined need to do so. Because certain vitamins and minerals at certain levels can be toxic. Some of them we can store within our body, which if you're getting too much over time can cause complications. You really don't want to be supplementing with something in that instance that you don't need. Something else that like the one other supplement that might be beneficial for some people, just due to the natural eating pattern of like Americans in general, is just like an omega-3 supplement. Some people we don't all eat a lot of fish. And some people struggle to eat enough EPA and DHA. So having that as a supplement can help as well. But my overall belief is it shouldn't be the crux of your diet. You shouldn't be considering it a part of your diet.
Yeah, I feel like it's too often viewed as like a Band-Aid.
Yeah.
And we're not really
we title
digging
these things meal replacements, right?
Yeah.
Like a shake is a meal replacement. Like that seems silly to me.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And it's I was going to say something and I lost it.
I interrupted Nick too, so he can.
It's fine.
Maybe it'll jog your memory.
Oh no, yeah, just that instead of adding something to an unhealthy diet, like maybe we should think about just trying to figure out like
Yeah.
the core of what we're doing.
And I feel like supplements and like the fitness community that has been so pervasive on Instagram for so long, that it just seems like the like logical next step of like, oh, well, the next step is just to like load your cabinet with all these supplements and you have to take all of them for good health. And it's just like a necessary step for like the next step in your like health journey, when it's like, you're kind of skipping the like nutrition part. That's probably more important.
Which is probably also the reason that person looks like that in the first place, is because they had
Yeah.
that dialed in. I mean,
Yep.
dialed in healthfully or not, but they did
Yeah.
something that in that category to get
Oh
themselves there
yeah.
first.
Mhm.
Supplements, I mean, outside of like certain like conditions where you're absolutely deficient in certain vitamins and minerals and it can help alleviate like symptoms of deficiency, like you're probably not going to see much impact of them overall. They're kind of just like a like micronutrient supplements are kind of just like a safety net um, for most people.
Mhm. Something we also like to ask is if there was somebody who was just interested in getting into this field and possibly becoming a registered dietitian, is there some type of advice that you'd like to give after reflecting on your own experience?
Ooh, truly, my advice would be to get a lot of advice from a lot of different people, to talk to a lot of different people about their experiences. Um, and then another thing with me getting like an advanced degree in my field, I get a lot of people that think like the logical next step in like your educational career is to continue getting like advanced degrees and that you eventually have to go for your PhD. And I'll actually discourage like several people from getting their PhDs because I sit there and talk to them and I'm like, well, what are your overall career goals? And they'll like list different career goals and I'm like, well, do you really need a PhD for that? Can you do that job without a PhD? And a lot of times it's yes. Like a lot of careers, like even as a dietitian, if I wanted to go work as a dietitian in like a clinical hospital or in a community, like different settings, I'm not going to get paid more because I have a PhD. I'm going to get paid for my RD and that's it. So it doesn't give me any like financial advantage in that specific field. The only reason well, not the only reason, but like one of the reasons that a PhD was smart for me in the field of dietetics was because I can teach at a university with a PhD, which is something that I have to have in most cases if I want like a tenure track professor position. Um, so I think it's very important to like get a lot of like different opinions and hear a lot of different experiences. Twitter's actually like a really good for like higher education and like RD stuff. Twitter is actually like a really good resource to like hear a lot of people's like thoughts and stuff. There's like academic Twitter and like PhD like thoughts and like tweets around people's experiences, which it can be really helpful to like hear like what you're going to be getting yourself into. And then just like reaching out to people. And I feel like I give this advice to people so many times. The professors that are in at universities that are like working within departments that you're interested in going to, they're there to answer your questions if you're a potential student. Like if you're looking to go to that school, they expect people to email them, to call them, to reach out, to want to meet with them if the pandemic ever ends. Like they're there to help you. And I feel like so many people I talk to are like, is that okay for me to reach out to them? And I'm like, absolutely. Their emails are listed on the website for a reason. Like you can find their emails, reach out to them. Most of them are willing to like sit down and talk with you or Zoom with you or hop on a phone call. Um, all of us didn't get in the positions that we're in without help or advice from somebody. And so it would be silly to think that we wouldn't go back and do the same for other students that are interested in following in the same field. So my biggest piece of advice would be to not just get advice from one person and find lots of different opinions because everyone's experience is different.
Mhm. Yeah, I just really appreciate your whole like m- idea of just giving back in a general sense. Um, like with knowledge, I think comes responsibility of like disseminating that knowledge, and yeah, that's what we hope to do with this, just in general. But
Yeah.
yeah, like you using your platforms on different levels is really nice, and I know beneficial for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's something, and from the getting kind of back to like where my whole issue started with like my interest in nutrition, one of my downfalls was getting horrible nutrition advice from like magazines and stuff. My mom can tell you like I hoarded magazines and I read all the like bad diet information, and it's really funny to think about, like, all of the diet information that I was getting from all the different sources, they would all tell you something different or something else to eliminate, to the point in which you couldn't eat anything for if you wanted to be healthy. And that, like, I think it's because I fell down into like the pseudoscience and like fad diet rabbit hole, and that's what caused me so much harm and like turmoil. Like, I want to be like a voice of reason, and like maybe like one person sees it and like doesn't fall down the like pseudoscience rabbit hole because I posted something that debunked something they said, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And people, it's like credentials don't mean everything, but people do put a lot of weight in credentials with their like trust of people. Like, I know some, like, there are doctors on social media that don't give good advice, especially when it comes to nutrition. And there's RDs that don't give good advice, but in general, people value like those credentials and put a lot of faith behind them. And so I do feel like you have an obligation to speak up, especially if you know that you're being scientific and evidence-based and combating some of those that are not.
Yeah. Maybe that's what we'll call the green check mark, like evidence-based.
Yeah.
It's the evidence.
That would be great. I'd love that.
I did want to sneak in one more question really quick too. I've been having this thought. Again, this is just me like doing my own thing over here. But the idea of like trying to determine do people do better digesting one thing at a time?
Oh yeah.
Versus like, and this, I don't even know where this thought comes from. Like, I didn't read it anywhere. I'm just thinking like, but I don't know. So I'm asking.
No, there's not evidence for that, and that's been like a like huge push in like the food combining is like a thing now. It's a trend where people think that they can only combine certain foods for like optimal digestion. And no, we have different enzymes that get released for different macronutrients to break them down, and they will get released in the proportion in which that they need to be to like metabolize
and just because
and
you're
break down those.
digesting one thing doesn't mean you can't or you have less energy to digest something else. Okay,
I mean, let's not eat like a full pound of steak and like a pound of Brussels sprouts like at the same time. That's just not going to feel good.
Yeah,
but
Nick.
If you're just eating a balanced diet, it's like your body is perfectly capable of digesting multiple things at one time.
Cool.
I feel targeted.
I targeted you.
Yeah, that's something that came up. Brendan and I were like working out one time, and we're like, man, is there something to this? And we didn't do the research at all, but we didn't try it out either.
Total bro science hypothesis.
Yeah, it was. So thank you for debunking our silly idea.
Saved me a lot of stress of multiple weeks of just trying to eat one thing at a time.
Yeah. God, that's horrible. If you had to like segment your meals and like, okay, I can only eat my carbs right now.
Yeah.
Okay,
this hour I'm only eating steak. And next hour I can eat all my veggies.
That's a lot of time eating.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So much here. Thank you so much. We really appreciated this. And we look forward to potentially having like another conversation in the future, because like we said, there's just so much packed into this topic. And just for people who are listening or watching, Dr. Hoffman provides so much good information on her social media. We'll definitely link all that in the description, and just check out all that information because it is really insightful.
And she's been on other podcasts. She shares a lot of other good information too. So make sure you check out anywhere she's sharing her information.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This has been fun. I've enjoyed it. It's been a
me
very
too.
fun chat.
Yeah. Thank you.